My name is Mark, and as Mark was saying, and I was born on the other side of the world. So if you took a pin straight through the middle of the earth, 12,000 miles, I would actually be on the opposite end of the world, just on the other side. So the village that I grew up in had no running water, had no electricity. We lived at the foothills of the Himalayan mountains. And so you could look out my hut and look out, and there were the Himalayas right there. And when I was 5 years old, then we were forced to come back to the United States. The military government there forced us out. And so we came back to the United States. My dad established a Bible college over in Chiang Mai, Thailand, which is right next to Burma. And then people would come from Burma over to the Bible college, and then they would be trained there, and then they would be sent back. So when I first came back to the United States, I hated kindergarten, absolutely hated it. And so I would go to school every day and just be fearful of how my teacher was going to react to anything that I said. So whenever I'd go in, she would ask me a question, and I would always answer, and just afraid of how she was going to respond, which was almost always, okay, go to the corner. And so I tried to be a good boy, and it didn't matter. Every time she's like, okay. And so I sat most of my kindergarten life sitting in a corner. You never told your parents why. Because then you were going to get in more trouble, right? Because you're sitting in the corner the whole time. Well, anyway, I didn't figure this out for a long time, but one of the reasons is because I spoke multiple languages. The word for yes in Lisu, where I grew up, is no. It sounds like no. So she's saying, are you going to be a good boy today? No. Are you going to help today? No. Okay, over in the corner. And that's how my first introduction to the United States was. It was really, really rough. That's not what I came to talk with you about today. But anyway, it's interesting just the difference in something small like that can be from one culture to another culture. Today I want to encourage you to pray. Matthew 7:7 says, ask and you will receive, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be open. And I want to share with you some stories today about prayer, and I want to encourage you to pray. Pray about the big things, pray about the small things, and pray about impossible things. I was a youth leader at a church, and I was in charge of the high school group, and one of the high school kids had a neurological disorder that he'd had ever since he was like 4 years old. And so I began to pray with him. Well, his parents found out that I was praying with him about this, and the parents said, we need you to stop praying with him. And I said, why? And they said, because when God doesn't answer his prayer, we don't want him to lose faith in God. Which sounded very ironic that you don't want to pray, because then when your prayer's not answered, then you would lose faith. And so I honored the parents' wishes, but then I had a friend of mine who was a real prayer warrior, and he and I prayed for this young man. And 6 months later, the mother comes up to me and says, and he'd had this since he was 4. The mother comes up to me and says, you won't believe it, but my son is completely healed of this disease. And yet she didn't want to pray, right? And so sometimes we're afraid to pray because we don't want our prayers to not be answered. We're afraid there's not a God out there. And I want to share some stories with you just about some things in my life where I've had prayer after prayer after prayer. And I know not every prayer gets answered the way that you want. And that's not today's subject, because that is a whole nother subject about how do you handle when things that you pray about don't get answered the way that you want. And that's a whole nother subject. But there are so many prayers that do get answered. And those are some of the things I want to share. So pray about the big things. My niece, she was 10 years old. She had cancer. She had cancer in her head. And it was a cancer that no person had ever lived with in their head. and no child with this particular cancer had ever survived. The doctors, when they came to do the surgery, basically told my sister, the parents, there is no cure for this, and we're going to go ahead and do the surgery to try to remove the cancer, but we're going to just pray. So these 5 doctors prayed over that. During the surgery, I went ahead and got a hold of my friend who had prayed about the neurological disorder. He came over to my house, and he prayed over me for an hour and prayed for Megan, is her name, and prayed against Satan. And just, I mean, he's a real prayer warrior. And so Megan today is 32 years old, or 35 years old, and has 2 children. And the only person to ever survive this, cancer that she had. And this is difficult to talk about because many of us here, if not most of us, know people who have had cancer, who have died. We prayed, and God didn't heal them. And so these are difficult things to talk about sometimes to a large congregation. The first time I shared this story, one of my closest friends was sitting in the front row, and her 2-year-old child had just died of cancer. They'd prayed, and so it was very, very difficult to even, talk about that. But again, that's another subject to deal with. But God does answer prayer, and He answers, big prayers, and He does impossible things. So we need to keep praying. When I was 28, I had a successful business. I hired 63 Bible college students. I had a computer business. Everything seemed to be going really well. Then my wife got multiple sclerosis. And my best friend turned on me. The short of it is that within a couple years, I owed $1 million. I had 3 children by myself, one of which was 1.5 years old at the time. I did not have an income, and I was flat on my back because I had messed up my back, and I had to lay on my back for like 2 weeks and couldn't even help. I had a girl who would come in and help with the children. And it was a very, very desperate time for me. And the level of my faith just, had gone down. I mean, I grew up as a missionary's kid, as, all this, and all these things tended to go well. This was not well. And I was suicidal. It was a very, very tough time. And it was my kids that kept me alive because I knew I had to, stay alive to take care of them. And so at that point, Jesus says, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed. So I had enough faith to pray for faith. And I said, God, please give me faith. And it was very tough because right during that time, my 1.5-year-old had just crawled across my stomach. I was laying on my back in the living room, got up in her high chair, got her fork, and said, food. And I couldn't feed her. And I said, God, just give me some faith. The next day, I get a phone call. It's from a lady. Her name is Faith. And she says, hi, I was wondering if I could come live with you and bring my 18-year-old son, and so he could finish out his last year because they had just moved to Boston, there in Cincinnati, Ohio. And anyway, I couldn't believe it. And so here's a lady who, she was, older than I was, but she had an 18-year-old, and she was an incredible cook. She took care of my children. She preschooled. She was also a teacher. She preschooled, my 1.5-year-old and all of that, and it ended up just incredibly amazing. I could have story after story, but short story is that all the debt that I had was erased, and one of them was to the state of Ohio, and so this particular case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and I'd hired lawyers, and they weren't able to do anything, and all this. So we went to the final meeting here at the Supreme Court, and the prosecuting attorney is, just drilling me, and everything looks hopeless. And I'm just asking for the Holy Spirit to give me something to say that will, have any kind of bond with the judge or something, because nothing else is working. And in reality was I didn't owe this money. So anyway, long story, but someone else had taken my company falsely and stuff like that. But anyway, and so the prosecuting attorney asked me a question. He says, answer the question. And so I tried to answer the question and said, it's not that. He said, answer the question, yes or no. And I said, it's not that kind of a question. It's not a yes or no question. He said, answer the question, yes or no. So anyway, so I just had this thought. I said, have you stopped cheating on your wife? Answer the question, yes or no. Well, if he says yes, then he is admitting that he was cheating on his wife, but now he stopped. And if he says no, then he's still cheating on his wife. And so the judge just started laughing out loud, brought everybody to the bench, said, we're done. This guy's not guilty, and freed me of $500,000, right there in that thing. And so another thing happened with the federal government at the same time. They had all this formal proceedings, et cetera, with them. This all has to do with taxes. And so all that stuff's not going well. And I go to the restroom. The guy with the feds, he comes into the restroom at the same time. And I told him, I said, I'm not guilty. He said, I don't care. He said, I would go after your mother if I can get the money. And I can. And so I said, well, I'm not guilty. He said, yeah. He said, I'll tell you what. You stop answering my questions, stop responding to my letters, I'll forget the whole thing. And there the rest of it was gone. And so these aren't things that are somehow by my intelligence, I figured out this stuff or whatever. God just moved in ways that were non-procedural, that were non-legal, that were, etc., just moved in people's hearts to help me in these difficult times. And I could go on about my wife's multiple sclerosis and a bunch of other things and other stories, but God has just answered prayer after prayer after prayer of things of such magnitude and such big things in my life over and over again. And it's not just the big things, it's also the small things. And so when I was little, I thought, okay, you're only supposed to pray about important things. And so I would pray that everybody would be saved. I would pray for everybody at church. I would pray for people's health, etc. So I would pray about all the big things. And one day, I was actually the missionary speaker. I was like 10 years old, and I was down in Tennessee, and I had lost somebody's baseball. I threw it into a field and could not find it. And so at that moment, I prayed that God would help me find the baseball. And sure enough, I found the baseball. Well, ever since that time, I did not just pray about all the big things. I prayed about small things. I mean, literally small things. And I've done that throughout my life, and it's been amazing that God has answered these small prayers that are not about eternal salvation or anything like that. They're just little things. It's like finding something. And it's been just, again, I have story after story. My wife was in a horrible automobile accident. And it just about took her life. She had to be flown by a helicopter up to Indianapolis, and I didn't even know she was up there, had the accident. And so, anyway, the hospital called me, and I went up there. And after she had, woken up, etc., she had, braces everywhere, etc., and she was in intensive care for almost 2 months, and critical care. And so, but one of the first things that she wanted, it's like she's a junior high kid. One of the first things that she wanted was her phone. And so she had lost her phone in this accident. And I'm like, where is it? She said, I have no idea, but I had it during the accident. That's all I know. And so I drove. It's about a 2-hour drive. I drove back to the scene of the accident, and I went right there to where the accident was. And so, she was going this way. Car hit her this way. All the debris was over here. And so that's where I went. I went over here where all the debris and everything was in order to try to find her phone. I looked everywhere and absolutely couldn't find her phone. And I prayed about it and asked God, again, it's a small thing, right? Asked God to help me find the phone. And I didn't hear an audible voice, but I heard a voice in my head that said, go over there. And at first I thought, okay, I'm just making that up because I'm talking to myself now, all right, and making this up in my head. And I heard it again. Go over there. Well, that's all the way across the street. It's not even close to where all the accident, stuff is. And so I go ahead, and it is a hayfield. And there's just, again, with whatever, the hay up here. And so I know it's not called hay. What's it called? What is hay before it's hay? When it's growing? Grass. Okay. Anyway, but it's up to here. And so there's no way I'm going to find it even if it is over here. So I go all the way over into this other area, and all of a sudden I see a little piece of red. And then I see another piece of red. It is a little bit of a line of debris from the car, and it leads right to her phone. There's just, no way that I was going to find that. And again, it's a small thing, but I've prayed about big things, and I've seen God answer those prayers. I've prayed about small things, and I know my wife's accident wasn't a small thing, but finding this phone was a small thing. And God has answered those prayers. And I have hundreds of stories about things like that. And also, I would encourage you to pray for impossible things as well. When I was, it was about the year 2000, and I got a phone call. My father was over in Asia, and I got a phone call, and the guy who's on the other end, Atapa was his name, he said, hey, if you ever want to see your father alive again, then you need to come right now. You need to fly. He's only got, maybe a day to live. So my mom and I and my son, we brought my son. He was 18 years old. So we flew over to Chiang Rai, Thailand. And I took $3,000 in cash, and we were able to get on a flight which was full, and somehow somebody canceled at the last minute. And so we got to the hospital there in Chiang Rai, which is a smaller town, and my dad was in this tent. And the doctor said, just let him be, just let him die in peace. And my mom said, there's no way we're going to let him die in peace. I didn't let him live in peace when he was alive, and we're not going to let him die in peace, right? And so my mom said, Mark, I want him out of here. I want him to go to Chiang Mai, which is a larger city. So there's Bangkok. You guys have all heard of Bangkok, huge city. And then there's Chiang Mai, the second largest city, and that's where a lot of missionaries are today. And then there's Chiang Rai, which is just a little place. So they don't let you out of the hospital over there unless you pay in cash. The bill was $2,800. I happened to have $3,000 with me. Otherwise, they were going to let him die right there. And so we were able to pay that. We got into a little transport. It's just a little car, little truck. And my dad was in the back of the truck. I'm in the back with him. And as we're going through the roads and jungles, to get to Chiang Mai, then the thing that's keeping him alive on his heart quit. And so I had to hand pump whatever it was while we were going, and finally we got to Chiang Mai. When we got to Chiang Mai, the doctor who's there, who's a little short Asian lady, she took one look at him across the way and said, he's bleeding to death. And I'm like, how can you tell he's bleeding to death from here? And she said, distended stomach, coloration, da-da-da. She went on, but she could tell he was bleeding to death. And so They found out what his blood type was, and it was A negative. And I'm not sure if anybody knows, but no Asians have Rh negative blood. They all have Rh positive blood. So that cut out 99.9% of all the population. The blood bank in Bangkok was closed for the day. They could not, because it was some kind of Thai holiday, they couldn't even fly any blood in. All of the missionaries, there were 50 missionaries there at the time, all of the missionaries came and gave blood to see if any of them was A negative. Not one of them was. Then I thought, you know what? We brought my son. My son has A blood, and I didn't remember if it was positive or negative. And so they tested his blood, and sure enough, it was A positive. And we needed A negative. The doctor told me he just has a couple hours to live. In Chiang Mai, there was a lady from Vietnam who was white, Caucasian, and she happened to go by a school where there was a sign posted that said, need A negative blood immediately. She happened to be just going by. She had A negative blood. She came to the hospital, saved my dad's life, and then when she was done, she started to leave, and the doctor stopped her and said, you know, you saved his life. And she said, would you let me know what his name was? And the doctor said, Laverne Morse. The lady got on her knees and just began sobbing. My dad had been in her home 30 years ago during the Tet Offensive when she was 6 years old. He was in her home in Vietnam. And so it was just an incredible, incredible thing that all of this, even happened. The next day, we were at the hotel, and my mom said, I wish that David Philbeck were here. He's a doctor, so I wish that Dr. David Philbeck were here. And I said, Mom, where is he? Because we'll fly him in. We'll do whatever it takes to get him here. And she said, I think he's in Dallas, Texas. And so I called Dallas and tried to get information. And they said, yes, we have a David Philbeck. And so they connected me to David Philbeck. And the guy goes, hola. And I'm like, oh, how in the world do we have somebody, that his name is David Philbeck? And so it wasn't the same guy. So we didn't know where in the world David Philbeck, would be, but he was somewhere, in Texas. So we couldn't find him. And so we prayed that we would be able to find David Philbeck. So I want you to remember this name, but Philbeck is the last name. So that morning, my mom said, well, I would like to go see Dad in the hospital. We went, and it wasn't time for us to be able to see him. And so they didn't let us in. And she said, well, I would like to go see Uncle Robert's grave. So my Uncle Robert. And so the hotel person gave a piece of paper to a taxi driver who didn't speak English and said, here's the address, basically in Thai. And so it was only like 5 minutes away. The guy starts driving us, and we go past the 5 minutes. We're 10 minutes, we're 15 minutes into the drive, and my mom is like, this can't be right, and telling him it can't be right. And so he's just waves her off, and we keep going. Now, Chiang Mai is a town of over 1 million people, and it's also very large, so it has a lot of, land. And so we are now 60 minutes into our drive, and, my mom is just hysterical that we're going off into nowhere. So we're on these dirt roads where all there are little huts with campfires. And the road is so small that only one car can even fit on the road. She's wondering what's wrong with the driver. There in the distance is a cemetery. And the guy tells us to get out of the car. My mom's like, no way, take us back to where you brought us from. You're not going to just leave us here in this desolate place. You know, no transportation, we don't know Thai, etc. The guy forced us out of the vehicle. So we got out of the vehicle. And it's a cemetery, but it's the wrong cemetery. And so we're on a hill that's like this. And we start walking up the hill just because we're walking on this road. And I literally put my hands in the air and said, I wish that there were a white person here who spoke Thai. Coming up the other side of the road was a white lady. She said, I'm white, and I speak Thai. She had heard me because I had said it so loudly. And she says to me, but I don't have time right now. And I'm like, what are you talking about? We're out here in the middle of nowhere, and you don't have time to help us? And so I just keep walking, and then I hear two women behind me crying. It is my mother and Mrs. David Philbeck. So how in the world God put us onto a road where this guy's supposed to be in Dallas, Texas, and we're out in the middle of nowhere, and the taxi driver goes to the wrong place, and etc. And so here we are. And she said, we drove right by you guys, and I said, and we couldn't turn around. And she said, she told her husband, I think I just saw Lois Morse on the road. He said, no, that's not possible. And he kept driving. She said, no, stop. So they stopped their car. She walked backwards, and we all found each other. God specializes in impossible things, in impossible prayers. And I know that everything doesn't get answered the way that we want. But I want to encourage you to pray and watch what happens, and pray about the big things, and pray about the small things, and pray about impossible things. And I believe that instead of your faith becoming less, your faith will just grow and grow and grow as you watch God answer your prayers. Thank you. Let's pray together.